It starts with a sound you're not supposed to hear in Florida anymore. It's not the frantic roar of construction from a new high-rise clawing its way into the sky. It's not the desperate whine of a real estate agent's phone ringing with another low-ball offer. And it's not the hollow, echoing silence that has defined the state's landscape for the past 2 years. The silence of abandoned subdivisions, of manicured lawns turning to wild, sun-bleached weeds, of swimming pools slowly turning a toxic shade of green. No, this new sound is quieter, more rhythmic. It's the simple, steady tap-tap-tap of a hammer, the scrape of a paint scraper against weathered siding, the laughter of people sharing a water bottle under the shade of a live oak. It's the sound of repair, the sound of rebuilding. But it's not the sound of the old Florida dream being resurrected. It's the sound of something new being born from its ashes. The American dream of home ownership didn't just die in Florida. It was autopsied on the front lawn of every for sale sign. The cause of death was a terminal condition with many names: the great insurability crisis, the climate risk reckoning, the affordability collapse. For decades, the fundamental promise of a Florida home was not just the sunshine, but the ever-upward trajectory of its value. You bought a house, you paid your mortgage, and you sat on a golden egg of ever-expanding equity. It was a machine for generating middle-class wealth, but the machine broke. When insurance premiums began to look more like a second mortgage payment, when banks started refusing to write 30-year loans on properties that their climate models predicted would be chronically flooded in 20, the machine seized. The music stopped. And what was left was a landscape of financial carnage. They have a name for them now: zombie subdivisions. Whole communities, often built in the frenzy of the last boom, that are now caught in a state of suspended decay. The houses are finished, the sod is laid, but the owners are long gone, either foreclosed on by a bank that doesn't know what to do with the asset, or simply walked away from, mailing the keys back to a lender in a final act of defeated surrender. I should know. My name is Elena, and for 15 years I was one of the top-selling real estate agents in the Naples-Fort Myers corridor. I sold the dream. I sold the waterfront views, the lanai with the sparkling pool, the promise of a life where your biggest worry was what to grill for dinner. I helped people leverage their life savings into a piece of paradise. Now, my job is more like that of an undertaker. I'm hired by banks and investment trusts to walk through these dead houses and assess what, if anything, can be salvaged. You learn a lot walking through a zombie home. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's a mix of stale, superheated air and the faint, sweet scent of mold beginning its slow, patient work in the drywall. You see the ghosts of the life that was supposed to be lived here. On a doorframe in a child's bedroom, you'll find a height chart, pencil marks tracking a growth that was abruptly halted. Leo, age 5. Leo, age 6. And then nothing. In the kitchen, stuck to the stainless steel fridge with a cartoon magnet, you might find a kid's drawing or a grocery list from 2 years ago. Milk, bread, eggs, hope. These families didn't leave because they wanted to. They were evicted by a spreadsheet. They were foreclosed on by a premium calculation made in an office tower 1,000 miles away. They did everything they were told to do. They saved, they worked, they bought into the dream. The dream, it turned out, was a lie. The houses themselves are monuments to a flawed ideology. They were built for maximum square footage at minimum cost, engineered for a quick flip in a rising market. They were not built for resilience. They were not built to withstand a Category 4 hurricane or the slow, silent creep of the water table. And they were certainly not built to be affordable. They were financial instruments disguised as homes. And when the market for those instruments collapsed, they became what they are now: liabilities. For 2 years, this was the story: a story of loss, of decay, of a market so fundamentally broken that no one knew how to fix it. The government couldn't solve it, the private market wouldn't touch it. But then that new sound started, the tapping of hammers. It started quietly in a handful of blighted subdivisions in places like Cape Coral and Northport, places that had been ground zero for the crash. At first, no one knew what was happening. We just saw pickup trucks and vans arriving, not with real estate agents, but with volunteers. We saw families, people who looked like the same families who'd been forced out, showing up on weekends with tool belts and work gloves. They were cleaning up the overgrown yards. They were patching roofs. They were hanging new drywall. And they were doing it together. This wasn't a developer or a bank. This was something else. This was the beginning of the Florida Land Trust Initiative. It's not a simple idea because it requires you to unlearn everything you think you know about real estate. The trust, as it's now simply known, is a nonprofit organization, but it's more than that. It's a new philosophy of home ownership. The founders, a coalition of housing advocates, disillusioned city planners, and a handful of quiet philanthropists, started with a radical diagnosis. The problem with housing in Florida wasn't the houses, it was the land. The land is what created the speculative frenzy. The land, with its proximity to the water and its finite supply, was what drove prices into the stratosphere. The land was the casino. So they proposed a solution. Take the land out of the equation. Here's how it works. The trust, using a combination of donated funds and low-interest loans, approaches the banks that hold the titles to these zombie homes. The banks are desperate. These properties are toxic assets on their books, costing them money every day in taxes and maintenance. The trust makes them an offer. We will buy the entire failed subdivision from you, dozens or even hundreds of homes at a time, for pennies on the dollar. The banks, eager to cut their losses, almost always agree. But the trust doesn't just buy the properties. In the legal transaction, they perform a kind of surgery. They sever the house from the land it sits on. The trust takes permanent ownership of the land itself. The land is placed into a community trust to be held in perpetuity, forever. It can never be sold for profit. Then they turn to the families. Families like the Chen, who lost their home in the crash and have been crammed into an overpriced two-bedroom apartment ever since, their credit ruined, their dreams shattered. The trust offers them a new deal, a new kind of dream. You can buy the house, just the house. Because the speculative value of the land has been removed, the price of the physical structure is a fraction of what it was before. A house that was once listed for $450,000 might now be offered to a family for $120,000. It's a price that is actually tied to the local median income, not the whims of an international real estate market. The family gets a mortgage for the house, just like a traditional home. They own the building. They can paint it, renovate it, pass it down to their children, but they don't own the land beneath it. For that, they get a 99-year, renewable, inheritable lease from the trust. The monthly lease fee is nominal, just enough to cover the property taxes and the administrative costs of the trust. Their home is theirs, in every way that it matters for a place to live and raise a family. But here is the revolutionary part. The part that makes the old guard of the real estate world recoil in horror. There's a covenant in the deed, a permanent restriction that governs the sale of the home. When the Chen family decides to sell one day, they cannot sell it for whatever the market will bear. They are contractually obligated to sell it at a price determined by a resale formula. They get back the full equity they paid into the house, plus a small, fixed percentage of the home's appreciation, enough to give them a modest return on their investment, a nest egg to move on with, but no more. The vast majority of the appreciation is stripped away, and the home is then sold to the next income-qualified family at a price that is still affordable. This is the core of the bargain. You give up the dream of winning the real estate lottery. You give up the chance to see your home's value double in 5 years. You accept that your house is not a financial instrument. It is not your primary vehicle for wealth generation. It is a home. In exchange for sacrificing that speculative upside, you get something that has become a priceless luxury in modern Florida: stability. You get a home you can actually afford. You get a community of neighbors who are all invested in the same deal. You get insulation from the violent boom and bust cycles that have repeatedly broken the state. You are no longer a gambler in the land casino. You are a member of a community. And it's not just a financial transaction. To join a trust community, you have to agree to the covenant. That includes a commitment to what they call community equity.
The first 6 months at Osprey Landing felt like a ceasefire, a pocket of impossible peace in the long war of attrition against Florida's broken economy. The sound of hammers had been replaced by the sounds of a community coming to life. The squeak of a swing set, the sizzle of a neighborhood barbecue, the murmur of a community board meeting under the pavilion. The zombie subdivision was gone, and in its place was a thriving neighborhood. The model was working. The Chens and 100 families like them were not just surviving, they were building a new kind of wealth, one not measured in speculative equity, but in stability and community, in the simple, profound relief of knowing that the roof over their head was secure. Their story, and the story of the Florida Land Trust Initiative, became a flicker of good news in a state starved for it. A handful of newspapers ran features. A national news network sent a crew for a segment on the evening news. And that's when the trouble started. Because in Florida, hope is a commodity and a threat. The old guard, the architects of the very system that had so spectacularly collapsed, had been watching. They had dismissed the trust at first as a fringe experiment, a well-meaning but ultimately insignificant project for a few hundred down on their luck families. But as the waiting list for trust homes swelled into the tens of thousands, and as other municipalities began exploring the model for their own abandoned subdivisions, they realized this wasn't an experiment. This was a contagion. It was a competing ideology that threatened the very foundation of their empire, an empire built on the principle that land is not for living, but for leveraging. And so they began to fight back. The fight was not led by a politician or a banker, but by a man who embodied the old Florida dream more than anyone: Marcus Thorne, the founder and CEO of Thorne Development Group. Marcus Thorne was a titan of the industry. He was a man who looked at 1,000 acres of pristine wetland and saw a master-planned community with a golf course and a marina. His company had built half of the gated communities in Southwest Florida, each one a monument to aspirational luxury. He was also one of the largest landowners in the state. To him, the idea of separating land from the house, of intentionally suppressing the value of real estate, was not just bad for business, it was a moral abomination. It was a perversion of the free market, a betrayal of the American promise that your home should be your castle and your nest egg. He saw the trust not as a solution, but as a disease, and he intended to eradicate it. The first salvo in his war was not a lawsuit, but an idea, a carefully crafted narrative pushed out through a sophisticated public relations campaign. Thorne funded the creation of a new advocacy group, a classic AstroTurf organization called Floridians for Property Freedom. Their website was a sea of smiling families and American flags. Their message was simple, seductive, and deeply poisonous. They argued that the land trust model was a trap. They ran ads featuring actors portraying concerned homeowners. One ad would say, they call it stability, but what they're really selling is a life sentence of managed poverty. They're stealing your single greatest opportunity to build wealth, the equity in your home. And for what? To create a permanent class of renters on land they control. They targeted the very core of the American dream. They ran radio spots and filled social media with infographics showing how much wealth a traditional homeowner would have built over 20 years compared to a trust homeowner. They called it the equity gap. They twisted the trust's greatest strength, its commitment to permanent affordability, into its greatest weakness. Affordability, in their telling, was just another word for stagnation.
They were selling the dream of the lottery ticket, the intoxicating possibility of a massive windfall, and framing the trust as the paternalistic, soul-crushing bureaucracy that wanted to take that ticket away. The message began to seep into the state's consciousness, sowing seeds of doubt and fear. I found myself on the front lines of this fight. After leaving the traditional real estate world, I had taken a position with the trust, helping families navigate the application process. My new job was about counseling, not selling. But as Thorne's campaign escalated, I was pulled into a different role. I knew how he thought. I had spent 15 years in his world. I knew the language, the talking points, the subtle fears he was exploiting. So I started to fight back. I wrote op-eds for local papers. I went on local talk radio. I tried to explain the difference between speculative wealth and foundational stability. I argued that the relentless pursuit of equity had created a system so volatile it had destroyed the wealth of hundreds of thousands of people. We were offering a different path, a more resilient one. But it's hard to sell a message of steady, predictable security when your opponent is selling the fantasy of a jackpot. The second front in his war was political. His lobbyists, the same ones who had fought the governor's shield plan, descended on Tallahassee and on county commission meetings across the state. They began pushing for new legislation, seemingly innocuous regulations designed to strangle the trust model. They lobbied for zoning ordinances that would prohibit the legal separation of a house from its land. They pushed for a new law that would invalidate any deed covenant that restricted a property's resale value for more than 10 years, a direct attack on the trust's core principle of permanent affordability. It was a clever argument, one that appealed to the cash-strapped local government still reeling from the crash. This political pressure had a chilling effect. Municipalities that had been on the verge of partnering with the trust suddenly got cold feet. The pipeline of new communities slowed to a trickle. The hope that this model could scale to meet the state's massive housing crisis began to dim. We were being systematically choked off, isolated, and branded as a pariah. The final front of the war was the most vicious. It was legal. Thorne's organization, Floridians for Property Freedom, filed a class action lawsuit, but they didn't sue the trust. In a move of cynical genius, they sued the first trust community, Osprey Landing, and named several of its residents as defendants. And at the top of that list was the Chen family. The lawsuit claimed that the trust resale formula and 99-year lease created an illegal cartel that artificially suppressed the natural market value of their homes, causing financial harm to the residents by robbing them of their potential equity. It was a completely inverted argument. The very people the trust was designed to help were now being told they were its victims, and Thorne's lawyers were offering to liberate them. The day the Chens were served the lawsuit was the day the war came to their doorstep. I was with them that evening in their living room. The legal documents were spread across the coffee table, a mountain of incomprehensible jargon. Mrs. Chen was in tears. Mr. Chen stared at the papers, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. He said, "How can they do this?" his voice shaking. "We were drowning. The trust saved us. This house, this life, it's more than we ever thought we'd have again. Now they're telling me I should sue? That I'm being harmed?" They were terrified. They were not wealthy people. They didn't have a lawyer on retainer. The thought of being dragged into a multi-million-dollar lawsuit was a nightmare. This was Thorne's true strategy. He wasn't just trying to win in court. He was trying to break the community from within. The lawsuit was a poison pill designed to create fear and division, and it started to work. A few families in Osprey Landing got scared. They started whispering, maybe the lawsuit had a point. What if they were missing out on a rising market? The old dream, the dream of the lottery, was a powerful narcotic, and Thorne was offering them a free hit. The community that had been so united in its purpose began to show signs of fracture. The community board meetings, once collaborative and hopeful, became tense and argumentative. The sense of shared purpose was being eroded by a targeted campaign of fear and greed. The climax of this stage of the fight came during a county zoning commission meeting. The commission was set to vote on a new ordinance backed heavily by Thorne's lobbyists that would effectively outlaw any new land trust communities in the county. It was a test case, a vote that would signal to the rest of the state whether the trust model had a future. The hearing room was packed. On one side, Thorne's lawyers and lobbyists in their expensive suits. On the other, dozens of us from Osprey Landing in our simple t-shirts. The commissioners listened for hours as Thorne's lawyers made their case about protecting property values and the sanctity of the free market. Then the commission chair asked if any residents wished to speak. There was a long silence. The families were scared, intimidated by the lawyers and the cameras. And then Mr. Chen stood up. He walked slowly to the podium, not with legal papers, but with a simple photograph of his family in front of their home. He put the photo down and looked at the commissioners. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent room. My name is David Chen, and I am one of the people that Mr. Thorne says he is trying to help. He says I have been harmed. He says my wealth has been stolen. He paused, taking a deep breath. Before we found this place, my family lived in one room. My wife and I slept on the floor. My daughter did her homework on a cardboard box. We lost our home, we lost our savings, we lost our hope. That is what we call being harmed. He looked directly at the commissioners. This house, it is not a stock, it is not a lottery ticket, it is our home. It is our peace. The wealth we have built here is not in the land, it is in our community. It is in our safety. Mr. Thorne wants to talk about freedom. The freedom to watch your home's value skyrocket is also the freedom to be terrified again. The freedom he is selling is the freedom to be terrified again. We do not want that freedom. We choose this. We choose stability. We choose community. Please, do not take that choice away from us. He picked up his photograph and walked back to his seat. The room was utterly still. The future of a new Florida dream hung in the balance.
The silence that fell over the zoning commission chamber after Mr. Chen spoke was a different kind of silence than the one that had haunted the state. It wasn't the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of consideration, of a narrative being unexpectedly and profoundly reset. For months, the debate had been framed by Marcus Thorne's lobbyists in the sterile language of market forces, property rights, and tax bases. But Mr. Chen had reframed it in the language of human dignity. He had held up a mirror to the commission and to the state and forced them to see not just a zoning ordinance, but a choice about what kind of society they wanted to live in. The commissioners, who had walked in that evening with their minds likely made up, looked at each other, their political calculations suddenly complicated by an inconvenient dose of humanity. The vote was a stunning upset. In a 3-2 decision, the commission voted against the new ordinance. They rejected the attempt to outlaw the land trust model. A wave of gasps and then applause erupted from our side of the room. It was an impossible victory, a David and Goliath moment that sent a shockwave through the state's political establishment. The story of Mr. Chen's testimony and the commission's surprise vote became a statewide news sensation. For the first time, the narrative wasn't about a struggling social experiment. It was about a resilient community successfully defending itself against one of the most powerful corporate interests in the state. The victory didn't just save one community, it supercharged a movement. Donations to the trust tripled, applications from families poured in, and municipalities that had been scared off by Thorne's lobbying were now calling us, newly emboldened to explore partnerships. The tide, it seemed, had turned. Marcus Thorne, however, was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a predator, and when one method of attack fails, a predator adapts. He recognized that his frontal assault, the attempt to brand the trust as an un-American pariah, had backfired spectacularly. It had given us a platform and made martyrs of our residents. So he pivoted. If you can't kill an idea, you co-opt it. You corrupt it from the inside out. Thorne's company and several other large developers suddenly had a change of heart. They began talking not about property rights, but about social responsibility and innovative housing solutions. They launched their own branded housing initiatives with names that sounded remarkably like ours. Thorne Community Homesteads, Suncoast Secure Living. They were in essence for-profit land trusts. I took to calling it trust washing. On the surface, their models looked appealing. They offered homes at a below-market rate, and they used the language of community and stability. But when you dug into the fine print, the poison was in the details. The land wasn't held by a nonprofit in perpetuity. It was held by a subsidiary of the developer's corporation. The 99-year lease had clauses that allowed for steep increases based on market fluctuations. And most importantly, their resale formula was a mirage. They allowed for a much larger percentage of the appreciation to go to the homeowner, which seemed like a better deal on the surface,
but it ensured that the home would not be affordable for the next family. It was a slow-acting poison, designed to re-inject the venom of speculation back into the system over time, eventually returning the properties to the full, volatile market. Thorne wasn't building communities. He was creating a new class of financial product, wrapped in the virtuous language of our movement. My role shifted again. I was no longer a defender fighting off a clear enemy. I became an educator, a truth teller in a newly confusing marketplace. I spent my days at workshops and town halls teaching people how to spot the difference between the real thing and the imitation. I created checklists for families to use. Is the land held by a nonprofit with a community board? Is the resale formula designed for permanent affordability? Is the primary mission community stability or corporate profit? It was a painstaking, frustrating fight, a battle against the seductive power of a slightly better deal, a slightly sweeter promise. But while we fought this new, more insidious war, the authentic trust communities began to evolve in ways none of us had anticipated. Having secured their existence, they began to ask what else the model could do. At Osprey Landing, the community board, now led by a confident and respected Mr. Chen, used the trust framework to tackle their next biggest challenge: energy costs. They partnered with a solar company to lease the roofs of every home in the community, creating a microgrid that lowered everyone's electricity bills and sold surplus energy back to the utility. The profits from that sale went back into the community fund, paying for a new library and a daycare program for residents. They were building not just housing security, but genuine community wealth. Other trusts followed suit. One community in a rural area purchased a tract of abandoned farmland and put it into an agricultural trust, starting a co-op farm that provided fresh, affordable food to the residents. The model was becoming a platform, a tool for communities to reclaim not just their housing, but a measure of control over their economic destiny. A few years later, I ran into Marcus Thorne at a statewide housing conference. We were both speakers on a panel. He was grayer, a little heavier, but he still had the same predatory glint in his eyes. During a break, we stood by a window overlooking the city. He was surprisingly candid. He said, I have to hand it to you. That little stunt your fisherman pulled in the zoning meeting was a masterstroke. Changed the whole game. He gestured to the city below. He said, look at it. Half the new developments out there are using my homestead model. I'm making more money than ever. You wanted to kill the market, but you just created a new one for me. We never wanted to kill the market, Marcus. We just wanted to give people an alternative to being its victim. The difference is your model is designed to extract wealth. Ours is designed to build it. He gave a dry chuckle. You're talking about that feel-good community nonsense. I'm talking about real wealth, equity, the ambition to climb the ladder. You've taken that away. You're teaching people to be content with just enough. It's a noble idea, I suppose, but it's not the American way. Maybe the American way needed an update. We've had a generation of climbing a ladder that was propped against the wrong wall. The ambition isn't gone. It's just changed. It's the ambition to raise your kids in a stable home, the ambition to know your neighbors, the ambition to build a resilient town that can withstand the next storm, whether it's a hurricane or a market crash. You think that's being content. I think it's the most ambitious project of all. He just shook his head and walked away. We were speaking different languages, inhabiting different worlds. It's been almost a decade now since the crash. Florida is a different state. It's a patchwork. The old world Thorne represents still exists. The gleaming towers and speculative bubbles are still there, though they seem more fragile now, more haunted by the memory of the last collapse. His trust-light communities are scattered across the suburbs, a popular option for people who still want to play a safer version of the equity game. But the authentic trust communities are no longer an experiment. They are an institution. There are hundreds of them now, anchors of stability in a volatile world. They are the first place that school teachers, firefighters, and nurses look for a home. They are quiet, resilient, and enduring. The Chen's daughter just got accepted to the University of Florida. The modest, predictable equity they built in their home, the equity Thorne's lawsuit tried to convince them was an injustice, is helping to pay for her tuition. Mr. Chen is now on the board of the statewide Land Trust Initiative, helping other communities get started. They never won the real estate lottery.
They never got rich, but they got a life. A real one. The Florida dream hasn't died. It has just grown up. It has become quieter, more realistic, and infinitely more durable. It's no longer about the roar of a speculative boom. It's about the steady, rhythmic sound of a hammer, of a community meeting, of children playing safely in the street. It's the sound of a dream, finally, being built on solid ground.